Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming to SolarWinds MSP Hero Series on security. Today we're going to talk about layered security and protecting your clients. And we've got a really great speaker to talk us through that stuff. As he's going through his slides, we should have some time at the end to answer questions. And so you'll find a panel on the bottom right of your screen to enter questions. If you enter in them, we will absolutely answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So with that, my name is Kelly O'Bray. I've been with SolarWinds a really long time, from the Hound Dog days, with over 20 years of channel experience, speaking to groups like you all around the world. I'm also the Vice Chair of the CompTIA MSP community, where we do much of the same things as I do with SolarWinds, try to train MSPs to be better MSPs. So SolarWinds is the largest community of MSPs in the world, with over 20,000 worldwide, 400,000 SMB networks, 5 million endpoints, and managing 1 million mailboxes. So what that means to you is that the community is there to assist each other with the types of things that you're dealing with as a managed service provider. And we provide a bunch of tools and places for you to share that information. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation. But before we get to that, I think we should pass it over to Eric Anthony, one of our senior sales engineers, and he's going to talk you through layered security. So with that, over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Kelly. And when Kelly says he's been here a long time, it's no joke. But I've been here almost as long, not as an employee, but I actually used the product for about 7 years before that. So as Kelly said, my name is Eric Anthony. You can reach me on Twitter at EricAnthonyMSP, or of course my email address here at SolarWinds is eric.anthony@solarwinds.com. As Kelly said, I run the sales engineering group here in the Durham office for SolarWinds MSP. I was a former MSP owner for 17 years because I actually had a break-fix company before we knew what this MSP thing was. Went off and did some C-level stuff in manufacturing and retail, and then came back and started a real MSP and had that for about 7 years. And now, SaaSnologist is kind of a name that I've given myself because I really have embraced the software as a service model, and I brought that up in this slide because one of the things I want to talk about today is how all of this as a service stuff is working both for us and against us when it comes to security. So I'll be touching on that as we go through the presentation. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about who the enemy is, what they look like, where they're trying to come in and get us at, and give us some statistics to let us know how these things are happening. So here we go with our first as a service comment. Crime as a service is actually becoming a thing. They're actually going out there and selling these viruses and these ransomware things as, you know, things that people can literally just buy on the darknet. So that's something we have to understand, is that people who don't necessarily have the technical skills to actually write and implement all of these exploits and things can actually just buy them now as a cybercrime toolkit. So those things are available to people who previously were not able to implement these or attack us with these tools because they didn't have the expertise to use them or build them. Now, of course, ransomware, highly publicized right now. We just had that new Petya threat that's been, you know, raging since the beginning of the week. And banking Trojans are also on the top of the list in terms of the things that are being targeted right now by those cyber criminals. Now, a couple of truth bombs here in terms of statistics. So the cybersecurity market in 2015 was $75 billion. By 2020, which we're already almost halfway there, right? Actually, technically, as of this month, we are halfway between 2015 and 2020. It's projected to reach $170 billion by 2020. So these guys are in it for the cash, and they have a great incentive because right now they are getting away with it. Cybercrime costs about $2 trillion by 2019 for businesses that are compromised by these security threats. And SMBs aren't necessarily aware. They're getting more aware of the threats to their individual businesses, but they're still believing in some falsehoods that they really need to be educated on. And that's one of our jobs as MSPs to do, is make sure they understand they're not too small to be appealing, because they may be small, but their bank accounts are still big enough. I mean, with all of these cyber criminals, especially the ones who are buying this and using it as a service, they can hit enough people with the way these things are used now that it actually gives them the leverage to go out and, like the ransomware, demand small amounts of money, but because they're infecting so many people, they're still making a large return on their investment. So SMBs are not too small to be appealing to these types of criminals. They also, a lot of these SMBs have vectors into larger organizations. So if you have a small SMB, I mean, look at Target, right? So Target is probably one of the biggest examples where the HVAC vendor had an exploit in one of their thermostats or in their software that they use to control those thermostats, and that's how those cyber criminals were able to get into Target's credit card machines. They say they don't have enough worth stealing. Well, that's not true, because they have not only their assets and the ransom of those assets, but again, like we just said, they have access to other SMBs and other large enterprises that do have significant value for them to get into. They have nothing to lose. This is probably the worst one. We've all heard stories of a small business, and it doesn't matter how small. It can be an attorney's office with, only a half a dozen people in it. Well, if they lose all of the documents that they've created over the years and they have no backup, that law firm basically is starting from zero, and they can't afford to do that. So they have something to lose in their intellectual property, and any consulting firm or anything like that is going to be the same way. Even a manufacturing firm that keeps all of its blueprints, or a civil engineering firm that keeps all of their designs on a computer, if those were encrypted, they're going to have to pay that ransom if they don't have another way to get it back. And reputation. Every business has a reputation, and we'll go through some statistics in a few minutes that actually show how customers perceive companies that they don't feel are secure or don't have the proper policies in place to protect the customer's information. So 58% of customers are worried about security incidences, and 29% think that companies are doing enough to protect their personal data. That means that the vast majority don't think companies are doing enough to protect their personal data. So this is actually a selling point for companies who are being proactive about protecting their customers' data. 66% of consumers are unlikely to do business with a company that's had a breach and is responsible for exposing information. 70% of the responsibility for protecting personal data lies with companies, while 30% sits with the actual customer. This is the customer's perception. So what's happening here is the customers believe that the responsibility for protecting their data lies on the business that they're doing business with, and ultimately that waterfalls down to you as the MSP as being responsible for protecting that personal data. Now we have a quote here that says, businesses that fail to do so could find themselves losing out to the competition, with consumers showing they are more willing to take their business elsewhere should a breach occur. So even if a small business doesn't think that they have a lot to lose in terms of intellectual property assets and things like that, they do have a lot to lose in terms of reputation. Everybody uses credit cards these days, so everybody's doing transactions with credit cards. That means you're touching customers' personal data. So how are these, how are these people getting into these? How are they actually compromising these systems? So what we want to look at is we want to look at the relationship between the exploit the Trojan and the payload. So what we're talking about here is what are they taking advantage of? Then what are they putting on the machine to initially infect it? And then what is that payload that the Trojan is delivering in order to actually take over the system or steal the data or encrypt it? So this is a kill chain analysis originally developed by Lockheed Martin, and it goes through the different points where the system can be compromised. So the WAN to the LAN, this affects the delivery of that Trojan. The exploitation, which is usually the patch, the Adobe or the Windows patch that's not being done, that the cyber criminals can take advantage of and be able to pry open access to those devices. And that's very important to understand because there are concrete things that we can do in order to protect our customer systems against those. With the Petya ransomware that's going around right now, that one in particular has an exploit in it where Microsoft released a patch back in March for that. So if you're up to date on your patching, chances are that exploit won't be able to allow the virus or the ransomware to travel from device to device on a network. Still doesn't mean you can't contract it through an email that they open, but it will keep it from traversing the network and affecting multiple machines on a network based on just one user compromising their machine. Installation, so making sure that you have admin rights for only those people who need them so that software can't be installed unknowingly. And then again, firewall rules out to the WAN and the LAN to keep things segmented off of the private network, but also to keep things from getting from one network to another network in an organization that's big enough to have multiple networks. And then of course, local to the device on the endpoint, you're going to have things like antivirus, backup, AV that actually detects things going on rather than just depends on signatures and things like that. So what are the top malware vectors? Okay, so email attachment. That's obviously the biggest one right now. Web drive-bys are also a big one. Those ads that if they click on them, deploy a Trojan, and then the Trojan goes forth and downloads the actual ransomware or virus. Email links operate pretty much like a web drive-by, but it's a link in an email. So very few of them are actually downloaded by malware itself or done through network propagation. Now the problem that we're seeing right now with the last two outbreaks is that network propagation has actually spiked a little bit because those exploits that were released actually allow the SMB protocol to be used to infect other devices on the network. And that's why these last two outbreaks are actually so dangerous, is if your machines aren't patched or have that SMB disabled, then it's going to be able to traverse the network and infect more devices than just the one that actually downloaded the malware. So what software is most exploited by these things? Well, Adobe Flash, we've known for a long time, is one of the top ones. Java, Internet Explorer, Firefox, Adobe Reader, and Microsoft Silverlight. Now, if we look at that, that's all web-based browsing stuff. So you want to make sure that all of that stuff is patched, all of it's up to date, so that the Trojans and things that are coming in can't take advantage of those exploits to do further damage. So in a perfect world of cyberkill chain analysis, the defenses at each stage would have given several opportunities for the endpoint to evade the final stage of compromise. What this means is that the more layers that we put in between the device and the outside world, the better chance we have of catching it at some point in between. So what we want to do is build our security system in a way that we look at the email before it comes into our server. At the server, we look at it. When it's downloaded to the device, we look at it. Once it's on the device, is it trying to connect back out? Is it trying to connect sideways to other devices? We want to make sure all of those vectors in one way or another are covered by firewalls, spam filters, virus filters, AV on the endpoint, something like web protection for being able to filter out requests back to command and control servers, all things like that. So where does the cybersecurity tech stack tend to fail? According to the results from a Barclays survey, 60 companies that were hit by successful ransomware attacks over the past 12 months, and this slide deck is probably about, it's only about 6 months old, so about 18 months ago, 77% of the respondents said that attacks bypassed email filtering solutions. So that's layer number one, right? It's only going to catch so much. So it's like a funnel or a filter. You're only going to catch certain types of things in each type of filter, so you need to have multiple filters in there to catch the different types of attacks. We do this in other things too, just like water, just like in air. We have to have different types of filters to filter out different things like allergens and larger particles, things like that. So we use different or multi-stage filters. The survey also found that 95% of the attacks bypassed the victim's firewalls and 52% bypassed anti-malware solutions. Again, no firewall is perfect, no AV solution is perfect. That's why you have to put these in layers. And then 1/3 of the attacks were successful even though the victim had undergone security awareness training. That's huge because even though we tell people about the problem, they still will go back and do, not remember, and they'll open phishing emails and links and things that they just shouldn't be opening, and therefore cause them to have attacks. So if you don't have these multiple layers in place, you're going to have a data breach. You're going to have a data breach coming to a theater near you. So what can we do? And what's the reality? Well, the reality is hope is not a plan. 71% of IT orgs reported at least one breach in the last 12 months. Now that's whether or not it caused damage. So this could just be a simple malware infection. It doesn't necessarily have to have had, damaging effects. Now, 18% of those did suffer some type of identifiable damage, whether the loss of a customer, an opportunity, whether it was financially related, whether it was, again, going back to their reputation, or simply operational. Did it cause them downtime? Because even with, a ransomware attack, even if you have a good backup, there is still going to be an operational cost to downtime. So you want to make sure that you're eliminating as much downtime for your customers as possible. That's why we call that, backup is actually the last line of defense. We hope we never have to get there because it does have an operational cost in terms of downtime. Now, most of these have been a failure of a critical business system or an accidental insider act. DDoS and fraud accounts for a little less than 1/3 of it. So again, that's 37%, 32%, 31%. So they're all different kinds of vectors. And so if you don't have these different layers, you can't protect against the different vectors. And it's clear that paying a ransom is not in anyone's best interest except the cyber criminals. Paying the ransoms just perpetuate the problem. And of course, none of us hope that we'll ever have to pay the ransom. The problem is the ransom is becoming so inexpensive that for a lot of companies, it's worth paying the ransom to get back to work faster. So whatever we do as MSPs, we have to make sure that the pain of paying the ransom is more than the pain of having to, pay to keep their systems, up to date and backed up and all of those things that we should be doing in terms of a layered security solution. So what do? Well, we need to make sure we have malware protection. We need to install a good antivirus solution on all the systems, keep the software and web browsers up to date, and the word consider here should be stronger. I would say mandate restricting access to inappropriate websites to lessen the risk of being exposed, obviously. Now, this also goes to admin privileges. We want to make sure that admin privileges are set such that standard users cannot install their own software. One of the worst things you can do, especially on a network, is have admin privileges for just a daily user, because I've seen so many attacks. In fact, people have gone out there and actually, put bets down on, you won't be able to infect this machine if the user doesn't have admin rights when they click on these things. And a lot of the times that's absolutely correct. So admin privileges goes a long way to keeping harmful things, and by the way, keeping users from doing, stupid things. So make sure that that's part of your policies, not just restricting access to inappropriate websites, but also making sure that your users only have the privileges that they need. Now, creating policies on how security updates are installed. Obviously, the best way to do that is to have some type of automated solution that will do that for you and simply report back when it fails. So what you want is for that to be running along, and in the case of an exception, you get notified. Because like we said, with these current threats that we're facing now, the patches came out 3 months ago. So these are things that were easily, firewalled or protected from, as long as that patching was kept up to date. Now, network security. Definitely want to increase the protection of your networks. One of the things I did as an MSP is, if I had a customer who wanted to provide, public Wi-Fi to their customers, okay, fine, but you put it completely separate on a separate router, separate firewall, and so that it doesn't have access to your actual production environment. Make sure you're using a good quality firewall. You're using proxies and access lists, things like web protection to make sure that they can only get to legitimate sites, sites of good reputation, and things like that. Secure configuration. You want to make sure that all of the information and standard configurations for all of your networks are stored in a safe place. And above all, and this probably shouldn't have to be said in front of this audience, but make sure that you change any default passwords, especially on network devices. Obviously, firewalls, routers, and switches are pretty obvious, but also those things like web cameras, any IoT device that has a username and password to log into a web interface, something like that. You want to make sure you can change those default passwords, because every day they're finding vulnerabilities in those IoT devices, and those are even harder to keep upgraded because of the disparity between all of the different things. So these are some of the things that the UK government did in response to some of these threats. Like we talked about before, managing user privileges. You want to make sure you restrict access both physically and through the network to IT equipment that they shouldn't have access to, and keeping information to it minimum, like I just said before, keeping access to all of those usernames and passwords, and different configurations that might give a cyber criminal a vector into the network. You need to keep those tightly wrapped. And of course, physical access to critical systems is pretty much a given as well. No longer can you or should you just keep a server in a closet somewhere. That closet needs to be locked. It needs to have, only certain people have the keys. And of course, when you do that, you got to make sure that it's ventilated properly as well, because we've all seen, what heat can do to a server. So physical access also very important. Now, home and mobile working, a lot of people think of putting a bubble around the office, but they not so much around personal devices when people may be working at home. Now, a lot of this has to do with the software they're using, or the remote access capability that they have to get into the office from their personal devices. But you need to make sure you're drawing a line around all of those things to make sure that none of those devices have the ability to compromise your customer systems, regardless of whether they're using customer-owned devices or whether the employees of those customers are using their own personal devices. Removable media, this is an obvious one. You want to restrict access to removable media so that somebody can't just come in and plug something in. And then, of course, monitoring. You want to make sure that we're monitoring all of the equipment and the networks under your control so that you can make sure that, extra devices aren't being added, that things aren't generating a lot of network traffic when they shouldn't, just all of the different things that you can do to monitor a system. Now, we've seen a lot of people, especially with our RMM tools, go in and create custom event log checks to actually look for things that would stand out in an event log. Login failures, which we actually monitor for by default in the remote management product, but other things like types of logins. So if that server should never be logged in with RDP, add a check to the server to look for RDP logins. That way you'll know if anybody ever tries to log into that server using RDP. There's lots of interesting things you can do with event logs to be able to kind of package your own custom security package in terms of monitoring. And if you're really going after the managed security space, you definitely want to look into adding those, actually creating a template maybe even with a whole bunch of those that you can add to devices whenever you might need to. Okay, so layered security from an aspect of, okay, what can we put together, what can we add as a package to make up, something that we can take to a customer and say, hey, this is what we're going to do for you in terms of a layered security package so that you don't have to worry all the time about all of these different threats that are coming up. So the first one we want to do is web protection. And then web protection is basically just going to go out there and make sure that the employees can't get to sites that they shouldn't get to. This will solve a lot of problems from the get-go. It also solves a lot of phishing problems and a lot of those email links, because it literally, if they click on something, it won't let them get there. It also will stop, even sometimes if you get a Trojan, maybe it was an executable that came in an email and you open it up. A lot of times it will stop communication between that executable and the command and control servers. So that's important. Mail protection. So mail protection helps on the other side with making sure that everything that comes into their mail is filtered not only for spam but for viruses as well. So based on signatures and based on a couple of different engines, we can actually filter out a lot of those things before the customer even has the opportunity to see them. Of course, you have to have some type of endpoint antivirus that you can manage and monitor. That's important. It's not just having the software on an endpoint, because as we all know, things can happen, services can lock up, and they can be running without AV for weeks, or I've even seen them run for months at a time, either not running at all because the service won't run, or because their definitions are 2 years out of date. So it has to be a managed and monitored AV product so that you're alerted when those conditions occur, so that you can make sure you remediate it before it gets so outdated, or they actually have a vector threat that comes in that way. Patch management. This is how the exploits happen. So somebody finds an exploit in Adobe or in Windows, and they write an exploit for it. That exploit allows them to download a payload that allows them to further infect the machine. So having all of your patches up to date, especially for the operating system, as well as all of those web-based applications that we talked about, and not just the browsers, but the plugins as well, we can keep a lot of those exploits from being able to be used to further infect the machine. And then, of course, managed online backup. So managed online backup is the final layer of protection against a catastrophic occurrence. So a couple of things here. Number one, it needs to be physically separate from the device. And even in some cases, there are remote backup solutions that map a drive to the device. That will no longer work because a lot of these ransomwares will actually go out and encrypt that data. So it has to be placed somewhere away from the device that the device does not have constant access to. So a backup software like Managed Online Backup or MSP Backup, where only the backup software itself can access that storage, is something that you want to make sure that you have, because that's what's going to keep it safe. If it's on a hard drive that's connected to the device, or if it's on a NAS that's mapped as a drive letter, those ransomware packages can go out and actually encrypt that data, making the backup useless. Now, of course, we want to stress again that backup is the last line of defense, because if you do have to resort to backup, it is going to have an operational cost to the customer. So you want to make sure that you have all of the other layers implemented so that hopefully you never have to get to that backup stage of the solution. So security awareness training, the one thing, because there's one thing that can negate all of those different layers, and that is the user. So we have to do everything we can to educate the customer to make sure they understand what's at stake, number one, and what the common threat vectors are and how they can commonly be tricked into clicking on something that they shouldn't. This is effective, just as effective at work as it is at home. People need to know this, because the information that they have at home can sometimes be just as valuable as at a business. Somebody gets a hold of your Social Security number and opens a whole lot of credit cards and takes all that money. It's still valuable to the cyber criminal, so they're still going to try and attack you at home just as much as at work. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about pricing and packaging. We've talked about what the threats are, what the layers are that we can put in place. So how do we actually implement a managed security as a service to clients? Well, the first thing is, how do you sell it? Well, you're going to have to leverage their fear, uncertainty, and doubt, common sales terminology, into making sure they understand what's at risk. And so there's different tools out there that you can use to calculate the cost of their lost data, to calculate the cost of their lost time, all of those kinds of things. But furthermore, you can actually use a tool. We have a tool called Risk Intelligence that you can actually go out and show them the data that cyber criminals would be interested in. So personal information on customers, credit card information, Social Security information, dates of birth, all of those things can be identified by Risk Intelligence, and it'll show you exactly where they are. Now, it's not uncommon for a business to have that type of information on a device, right? I mean, a doctor's office is going to have a ton of personal health information. However, it needs to be quarantined into a safe space, a place that not every user has access to, only the users that need it have access to it, or only the applications that actually need to access the data have access to it. So Risk Intelligence will help you do an assessment so that you can pull all of that stuff into one protected space. But then also it can kind of go into monitoring mode, where you've quarantined this safe space. You've said, okay, it's allowed for this type of data to be here, okay? But it's not allowed to be on somebody's laptop or over here on the receptionist's computer. So when somebody's credit card suddenly appears on the receptionist's computer, or the office manager takes her laptop home with an Excel file that has everybody's Social Security numbers on it to do payroll, it's found, and you as the MSP can go in and say, hey, you've got this data and it migrated out of the safe space. Somebody copied it, and you need to make sure that is deleted and make sure that the users understand that they should only use that information from this safe space. Now, you also need to try and sell it as a bundle. It's much easier to sell these things as a bundle under the heading of security rather than try and actually explain each one as a separate product. Explain the importance and what they have at risk in terms of security, and say, okay, and now I have a package that's going to take care of this. This is also a good way to get in the door with customers who aren't so keen on managed services and paying you monthly just to watch their stuff or have access to their stuff. Some of them still don't get that, but security's in the news. They have to understand that, and therefore we definitely want to make sure that we can try and get in there with a managed security package, because that fear, uncertainty, and doubt is really going to help you to sell that package over and above what can sometimes be the ambiguous banner of managed services. So managed security can definitely be easier to get in there for certain types of clients. I recommend at least a 3x markup on your cost, but don't let that be the only factor you look at. As with any managed service package, you have to look at what you're willing to do in terms of labor, and make sure you're not losing money by offering more than what you should be. If you're going to offer your restores for free, you're not going to charge for that labor. Your cost has to include how much time it's going to take you to queue up that backup job and get it done, and make sure you get everything back in place. So don't make sure you don't discount that in terms of leaving it out of your calculations of what you want to be charging for a managed security package. Now, the other thing is 3x markup after any discounts. So if you plan on offering discounts as a sales tool, make sure you make this 5x or 6x so that you can offer whatever discounts you think you might be, so that you're not discounting off of 3x, you're discounting off of 5 or 6x. And one last piece of advice: if they won't do anything in terms of security, in terms of the layers and all the different things that they should be doing for security layers, make sure they're doing backup. Because if they're not doing backup, they don't, it's like going out there completely unprotected. They'll have no ability to restore their business back to functionality if somebody encrypts all of their data, besides paying the ransom. And as we all know from the stories, those things don't always, the paying the ransom doesn't always work. Things happen that can cause encryption keys to go bad. The data is encrypted. It's not 100% guarantee that you're always going to get it back. So Kelly, I don't know where you wanted to step in here in terms of.
Yeah, that's perfect. That was absolutely a great overview of how to put layered security and how to protect your clients. We've got a series of questions here that I'd like to do now before we go into more about the product portfolio and our next webinar for the Hero series. So you talked about the current current attack that's happening with ransomware, and that the patch came out in March, and so anybody who's patched their systems, even if they get through, won't be at risk. In today's environment, what's the patching time frame that these guys should make sure that they have their patches up to date? Like, does it have to happen within X number of days, or is a month enough? What's kind of your thinking on that?
So it varies. Obviously, the quicker the better, but there's some trade-offs, because the more you try and patch, there is, CPU overhead, it's going to use system time. I would say on critical systems, you want to patch as much as once a week or once a day, even for some highly critical components. But for standard workstations, most of the exploits don't get written for about a month after they're discovered and patched. So usually if you're patching at least once a month, you're pretty well covered. The biggest thing is to make sure you're staying up to date with the reporting on that patching so that you know when patches fail, because that's where you can get into a point where, yes, you pushed out a patch in March, but if only 9 of the 10 computers got it, then you've got one that's unprotected. So you have to stay on top of that regardless of how often you're patching.
Okay, great advice. Perfect. So I'm down at Cisco Live this week, and the IoT is all the rage. A whole bunch of sessions about it, a whole bunch of new applications, new devices that are being entered onto the network. How can we control, or how do we address the fact that people are going to plug things into our network that maybe we don't know about, and how do we even know about them?
So the first thing, obviously, we'll go back to not having everybody know what the Wi-Fi password is, right? If you want your employees to be able to use their cell phones on Wi-Fi when they're at work, like I said, set up that separate public network so that you don't have to worry about that piece of it. And you're keeping all of your production networks segregated from all of that other stuff. The other piece is to make sure that you're looking at the network from time to time, and you're using something like the Active Discovery tool within the remote management platform to be able to see new devices that are coming on. You can go into Active Discovery and very quickly filter by the last date seen or the first date seen, and be able to see new devices that have come up on the network. Things like that.
Okay. So I hear, lots of people say, well, you should have policies in place that, people can't access your network and they can't plug things, but we know that is just, not something that a lot of small business owners are going to adhere to. They're going to plug things in, they're going to buy new equipment, they're going to, and so is there something you can do from a user awareness training or something like that to help them understand that maybe that might not be a great thing for their security of their business?
So yeah, obviously, what you want to do, the ideal situation as the MSP is you are their managed service provider. So say, let me take over this whole thing from you. Let me manage everything, and don't do anything without running it through me first. Now, of course, that's optimal. And what you just mentioned is a lot of small business owners don't like to do that because, let's face it, it costs money for us to fully manage a small business, right? And in fact, small businesses can actually be less profitable because they're so small and things tend to be not so standardized and things like that. But if you can drill into their psyche that, they really have to come to you, and that it doesn't cost more. In the long run, it actually costs less because they don't have to worry about it. They don't have to source anything. They don't have to look anything up. And you're providing them a reliable tool based on your experience as an MSP for something that is going to be secure and fit their needs. Just something as simple as not making all the network jacks in their office live, and only making them live when there's actually an employee with a computer, in that office. We do that here in the office. You go in, you just can't go in and plug something in somewhere. All of that is kept track of, and there has to be, somebody assigned to that port before we'll actually make it live.
Great advice. Perfect. So I think we get time for one more question. And so we talked about the user being kind of the last weakest link in terms of, actively working against trying to put all the layers in and trying to get things through the layer by clicking on different emails and those kinds of things. Do you have any advice in terms of user training and how often or how to do it, or how to do it, profitably?
So customer training doesn't just have to be about teaching the stupid people not to be stupid. It's actually a marketing opportunity, and it does more than just the user education. But the user education, there are lots of resources online that you can use. There's actual companies that will come in and do it for you, especially via something like a WebEx or a GoToMeeting like this today. So there are those resources out there, but I would tend not to use those. What you want to do is come up with what your idea of user training should be, because your standardization, something that makes you unique as an MSP, is how you do business and how you make sure your customers are secure. The other thing is, nobody knows your customers as well as you do. And so a generic user education is not going to be as effective as you coming in and doing it for them. But that being said, it has to be formal. You have to have a slide deck. You have to have material. It's going to take you some time to develop it, but it will be well worth it in the long run. The other thing that this is going to do is it's going to build the relationship between you and not only the business owner or the business management, but the end users. And the more the end users respect you and your knowledge, the more they're going to understand the importance of paying attention and actually following through with using that education in their experiences, on the network. So it's not just about the conveyance of information, it's also about building that relationship of trust between the end users and the MSP so that they'll actually listen to you and take that advice. It's also a marketing opportunity, right? So every time you go in there to do some type of user education, you have the opportunity to go in and not blatantly sell something, because none of us like that. We don't like to be sold to. But if you're educating them on the security, maybe it's also time to educate them on, moving their email to the cloud or implementing Office 365, something like that. Gives you that opportunity to educate on other things in addition to the security piece.
Okay, great advice. I know that on our previous Hero series, we had a panel of MSPs, and they talked about user training and the fact that, it's really important to do. It's really something that they would like to do more of, but they just have a challenge, finding the time to get out and see all their customers and actually go through all the training. So probably something for another session when we talk about the Hero series. But at this point, I think, do you want to go through the different areas of products that we have so that people can understand, where they go for the different parts of the different layers for security? And then I'll talk about the next Hero series and what we're going to speak about next month, and then we'll do a wrap up. So,
so I'll kind of take my former MSP hat off and put my sales engineer hat back on. And so we have some specific MSP tools, obviously for people who are just getting into managed services or are still doing, primarily break fix. We have a great ticketing and PSA tool to make sure that you're capturing all of that data, all of the billable time and materials, and keeping track of, what work needs to be done. The standalone backup product, the remote control, the MSP Anywhere product can be purchased separately from the remote management products for doing break fix engagements. Mail security, so that's that mail filtering layer that we were talking about earlier, also reduces spam by a great extent and also offers you the ability to have mail continuity. So if your mail server ever goes down, it gives you the ability to give them a place where they can log in and actually see and respond to the emails that are coming through. And the data security, that's the risk intelligence product that we talked about, allows you to manage and monitor that data that the cyber criminals are really going after on your network. Then we move into the more formal remote monitoring and management tools, both in MSP RMM and the MSP N-Central product. Allows you a lot of things to monitor, manage the end devices as well as some of the network stuff. Again, has the remote control piece, has the PSA integration, so the work that you do in the RMM products links back and forth between the ticketing product, automation, so a lot of those remediations that you would do on some type of failure. So like, let's say a hard drive fills up and you get the alert for that, you can have that trigger automation that will run a disk cleanup on that device so that you can automatically free up that space. Of course, reporting, we talked about reporting being incredibly important when it comes to patch management and making sure that you're aware of the failed patches. And then, of course, all the integrated tools that you normally find in an advanced RMM tool in terms of backup, antivirus, patch management, again, like we talked about, ticketing, remote control, web protection, and mail protection. All of those pieces can be integrated into the RMM and N-Central tools so that you can actually be monitoring it from one dashboard. And then sliding into the SolarWinds Classic space, we have enterprise IT tools for those people who need just a larger on-premise tool to do certain things for larger network environments. So we have NetPath and NetFlow, network topology, backup and configuration, as well as log and event management. So all of those things are available under the SolarWinds umbrella and can be used to make your MSP build those layers of security that we were talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a great overview of the different options for people. And so, you know, whether you're a smaller or a newer MSP just getting into the space, or you're dealing with some of the largest enterprise clients out there, SolarWinds can offer you a tool and a series of tools to help improve both the processes within your managed service practice, but also the security of your client's environment. If you want to just go to the next slide for me, Eric. I want to talk a little bit about where we're going next month. So as I mentioned at the outset, the Hero Series webinars are really based upon a quarterly theme. This quarter's theme is security. It's open to all solution providers. It's usually the last Tuesday of the month, although I'm sure someone's going to point out that, hey, Kelly, today's Thursday. So we bumped it by a couple of days just because of scheduling issues. So next month on June 25th, same time, we're going to have Art Gross come talk to us from HIPAA Secure Now, all around the kinds of things you need to do to help your customers address compliance around HIPAA, as well as he's going to focus in on the user itself or themselves and some things you need to do to make sure that they're not working actively against all of the layers you're putting in terms of security. So we're really excited about that. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar as well as a link to sign up for next month's webinar. So look for that early next week. And with that, I think we'll sign off, give everybody back 8 minutes of their day. And thank you very much for taking time to come learn about layered security. Thanks again to Eric Anthony, who I think did a great job of really describing not only what the threats are out there, but also the layers you can put in place to help protect your clients against those bad things that people are trying to do with their networks. So with that, we'll sign off. I hope everybody has a great day, and we'll hope to see you next month.